April 18th, 2018. A white evidence label pressed against a transparent plastic bag. Inside, a discarded tissue. The man who dropped it on his garage floor had no idea he was being watched. 17 years earlier, the FBI had uploaded his genetic profile to a national database. The system ran it constantly, year after year, finding nothing. It failed not because the science was wrong, but because the architecture was built to miss him. He was a former police officer. He knew exactly how to stay invisible. The 32 years before that tissue fell is the real story. Before reverse family trees, a technique that builds a suspect's identity backward from distant DNA relatives, existed, the weighting was measured in human lives. 32 years is not an abstraction. It is measured in specific mornings, in half-packed suitcases. In September 1975, journalism professor Claude Snelling stepped into his Visalia backyard to protect his 16-year-old daughter from an intruder. He was shot twice. He died. The science that would eventually identify his killer was still 9 years from being discovered. The attacker moved north, leaving shattered doors and pre-written threats across Sacramento suburbs. Families were left waiting for a miracle that had no name yet. Jane Carson Sandler survived a brutal Sacramento attack in October 1976. For 42 years, her children never knew why she feared certain doors at night. Then came 18-year-old Janelle Cruz, Southern California, May 1986. She was moving to Hawaii in 3 days. Her suitcase was already packed. Biological evidence collected from her home sat in cold storage for more than 3 decades. Investigators had a genetic profile, a unique biological signature from the crime scene. They had no mechanism to trace it back to a name. They were waiting on a forensic tool that did not yet have a name, while the killer lived freely. When Claude Snelling died, criminal identification rested on a fragile foundation. Fingerprints, basic blood typing, microscopic hair comparison, a technique the National Academy of Sciences would later declare lacked the scientific rigor required for courtroom use. That was the complete toolkit. There was no automated biological database, no national system for matching evidence at scale. Police collected semen from multiple crime scenes across the state. They had physical proof in their hands. But they were staring at a locked door with no key. The technology simply did not exist. The true weight of this technological lag was spoken decades later. At the August 2020 sentencing hearing, Diane Cruz stood before the man convicted of murdering her daughter. She told him Janelle was supposed to grow old. She was not supposed to be 18 and stopped. Every missing database, every rejected method, every year that evidence sat in a cold storage box, meant another year a family lived with frozen time. The tool had to arrive. The human cost of waiting was too high to abandon the search. In 1994, a senior detective dropped a heavy box of old files onto the desk of 26-year-old criminalist Paul Holes. That same year, the FBI launched CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database built on short, repeating stretches of genetic code used to identify individuals. The attacker's profile was among the very first uploaded. Holes ran the search, no match. He ran it again in 1998, still nothing. 2001, 2005, 2010. Always nothing. The obsession would consume 23 years of his career. Every year the search failed, Holes faced a quiet terror. He feared the killer was already dead, or that time would run out before the science caught up. But the system was not failing. It was functioning exactly as designed. CODIS only returns a hit if an offender has a qualifying felony arrest after the database goes live, meaning the suspect must be arrested for a serious crime and added to the system. The man they were hunting was living just 40 kilometers from Holes's office in Citrus Heights. He complained about neighborhood lawns. He raised 3 daughters. He was perfectly invisible, in plain sight. The most brutal detail of this timeline is the overlap. In September 1984, British geneticist Alec Jeffreys, working at the University of Leicester in England, noticed unique barcode-like patterns on an X-ray film. He had just discovered DNA fingerprinting, the ability to identify a specific individual from their genetic code. Janelle Cruz was murdered in May 1986. The science that would eventually name her killer was born in a laboratory just as he was committing his final known crime. The method and the murder overlapped by less than 2 years. Yet it would take 32 more agonizing years for them to converge. The lag was a tragedy of timing. Jeffreys first applied his technique to a criminal case in 1986. A teenager had confessed to 2 homicides in Leicestershire, England. The new test proved 2 things instantly. The confession was entirely false, and the actual attacker was a man named Colin Pitchfork. Pitchfork became the first person in history convicted by DNA evidence. But in America, the technique had never seen a courtroom. The evidence from California was packed into boxes, and the waiting continued while the science slowly crossed the ocean and gained legal acceptance. While the physical evidence sat in the dark, the technical ladder was being built rung by rung. In 1983, biochemist Kary Mullis discovered PCR, a reaction that copies and multiplies genetic material in the laboratory, making tiny or degraded samples readable. It allowed scientists to test samples previously considered completely useless. But having a readable sample is only half the battle. You still need a name to check it against. The missing piece would not come from a police station or a federal lab. It would come from the internet, built by people who had no interest in forensics whatsoever. In 2007, commercial ancestry tests launched for the general public. For $99, anyone could spit in a tube and receive a detailed geographic origin report. Then, in 2010, 2 retirees built a free website called GEDmatch. Users could upload their raw genetic data to find distant relatives. There was no paid staff, no legal team. It was an open tool built with zero anticipation of criminal use. By 2018, it held roughly 1 million profiles. A massive, unregulated library of human genetics, assembled by hobbyists. The forensic power of this database was never engineered. It was discovered. The door had been sitting unlocked for years. But accessing it required a fundamental shift in investigative logic. Traditional investigations start with a suspect and test their DNA. This new approach started with the DNA and built a reverse family tree, working backward from distant strangers who shared partial genetic markers to find the suspect. It was a theory that promised to bypass federal database limitations entirely. But the first time someone tried a similar method, It nearly destroyed an innocent man. The risks were not theoretical. The traditional system was completely blind to Joseph DeAngelo. After a minor shoplifting incident in 1973 cost him his police job, he never picked up another arrest. He understood exactly how the federal databases worked. He knew they required a qualifying felony, a serious criminal charge, to flag his profile. He was not hiding in the shadows. He was hiding behind the rigid rules of the very institution that was trying to catch him. He never made the slip they were waiting for. The system was architecturally dependent on an error he never committed. In 2014, Idaho police tried to trace a suspect using a public genealogy database. They got a partial hit, a distant genetic match, pointing to a Louisiana pastor. The focus quickly shifted to his son, a documentary filmmaker. Police scrutinized his social media. They found photographs of him visiting Idaho. He voluntarily gave a DNA sample and waited 33 agonizing days. The results proved he was completely innocent. But his name had already leaked to the national press. The experiment had caused severe collateral damage to a man who had done nothing wrong. That failure in Idaho became the architectural ancestor of the method that finally worked. It taught investigators 3 brutal lessons. First, a partial familial hit is not a suspect. Second, reverse family trees require rigid filters for age, geography, and sex. And finally, confirmation requires a direct genetic sample from the actual person, not circumstantial evidence alone. Without that public mistake, the technique might have remained reckless. Learning from false positives is what made the science usable. It forced the creation of guardrails that would later prove essential. The near destruction of an innocent man's life was the price paid to refine the tool. Those 33 days of public suspicion forced the entire field to evolve. It proved that matching DNA to a distant cousin is a dangerous game if you do not know how to navigate the branches of a family tree without forcing the evidence to fit a predetermined conclusion. The system needed someone who understood that discipline. It needed a patent attorney who practiced genealogy as a hobby. Someone entirely outside the traditional law enforcement structure. Barbara Rae-Venter was a retired biotech patent attorney living in California. She was not an FBI agent. She was a volunteer, helping detectives identify unknown bodies using genetic genealogy. Her proving ground was a child abandoned in 1986. The adult victim did not know her birth name or her parents. Rae-Venter uploaded the genetic profile to the open database and let the tree converge naturally, using census records and obituaries to trace living relatives backward to the source. She successfully identified the child as Lisa Jensen. The method was patient, methodical, and entirely unprecedented in its accuracy. The Lisa Jensen case proved the concept in 2017. Investigative genetic genealogy, tracing a suspect through the DNA of distant relatives, actually worked. Later that year, Detective Paul Holes read about her success. He was 50 years old and weeks away from retirement. He called Rae-Venter. They took the killer's profile, dormant since 2001, and converted it into a format the public website could read. They uploaded the file. The system flagged dozens of distant cousins instantly. The 23-year wait was suddenly collapsing into a matter of days. While the tree was being built, a parallel tragedy had already closed. Writer Michelle McNamara had spent years hunting the killer in the dark. She wrote a letter to him, predicting the day he would hear footsteps on his driveway. She died in her sleep at age 46, her book unfinished. The method that would finally produce his name did not exist when she died. 56 days after her completed book was published, the arrest happened. She never lived to see the ending she had so accurately predicted. Rae-Venter filtered the distant cousins by geography, age, and occupation. The sprawling tree collapsed onto a single branch. Joseph James D'Angelo. On April 18th, 2018, agents watched him walk into his Citrus Heights garage. He dropped a used tissue on the concrete floor. A technician collected it with sterile tweezers. The laboratory rushed the test. The results matched the profile that had been sitting in storage for decades. The probability of a random coincidence was 1 in several trillion. The science had finally caught him. 6 days later, agents walked up to the house on Canyon Oak Drive. D'Angelo was standing in his yard. He wore a gray polo shirt and a lost gaze. They placed him in handcuffs. Paul Holes, who had officially retired 3 weeks earlier, was parked down the street in his civilian car. When the radio confirmed the suspect was in custody, Holes pulled over. He sat in the silence of his vehicle and wept. It was not joy. It was something infinitely heavier. The ghost finally had a face. The next morning, the district attorney stood before a crowded room. She stated that the answer was always going to be in the biology. They simply had to wait for a way to use evidence they did not yet know how to use. The physical act of collecting that tissue took mere seconds. The scientific architecture that made those seconds mean something took 32 years to build. But the technique was deployed before any formal regulations existed. They built the plane while they were already flying it. In August 2020, dozens of survivors finally faced him in a makeshift courtroom. Jane Carson Sandler looked directly at the man who had terrified her 42 years earlier. She told him he did not get to keep what he took. Beth Snelling testified for the father who died protecting her. D'Angelo pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, receiving multiple consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. The science had done its job. It gave the victims the one thing the system had denied them for decades: a name. The long wait was over, but the method that caught him carries a permanent shadow. The federal policy governing genetic genealogy was published 17 months after the arrest it was supposed to regulate. When the database later asked users for explicit consent, 70% opted out, meaning the vast majority of profiles that enabled the investigation would no longer be available under the new rules. The architecture of this science places millions of relatives in a dragnet they never agreed to join. The tool solved the impossible case, but the constitutional doctrine to manage its power has not yet been built. Which leaves a chilling question hanging over the future. If investigators can bypass federal limits using the DNA of distant relatives, whose genetic code are they searching through right now?